Hallo und herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Lea Vogel und das ist mein Podcast Healed. Ich freue mich sehr, heute eine weitere Folge aufzunehmen und in dieser Folge habe ich einen Gast. Das freut mich total und mein Gast ist Dr. Anita Johnston und Dr. Anita Johnston ist eine wirklich wahnsinnig tolle Frau, die mich schon lange begleitet. Das weiß sie aber gar nicht, also sie wusste es nicht bisher. Denn ich habe vor einer ganz langen Weile ihr Buch gekauft und das Buch heißt Die Frau, die im Mondlicht aß. Und ich glaube, viele kennen sie, viele, die sich mit dem Thema Essstörungen, Körperakzeptanz auseinandergesetzt haben, sind über sie gestolpert, weil sie da wirklich einen sehr, sehr großen Raum einnimmt. Und dieses Buch, das sie geschrieben hat, das ist auf eine ganz besondere Art, würde ich sagen, hilfreich und einzigartig. Denn in diesem Buch, da spricht sie viel über das darunterliegende Thema, das Menschen begleitet, die eine Essstörung haben. Und somit wird das Buch schon wieder sehr viel spannender für viele Menschen, auch die ohne Essstörung. Das Buch da geht es viel um das Thema Weiblichkeit, um das Thema, wie verbinde ich mich eigentlich mit meiner Seele, mit meinem Purpose auf dieser Welt und was passiert im schlimmsten Fall, wenn wir nicht mehr verbunden sind mit unserer Seele, mit unserem Purpose, mit unserem Ziel und mit dem, was wir so sind in dieser Welt und auf dieser Welt. Und in diesem Buch, da spricht sie wirklich über Weiblichkeit, über die unterschiedlichen Attribute, die wir Menschen mitbringen, über das Yin und das Yang, über das männliche und das weibliche Element in jeweils beiden Geschlechtern. Sie spricht viel über Metaphern und viel über Geschichten. Ich glaube, damit hat sie mich wirklich bekommen. Und ich muss trotzdem der Ehrlichkeit halber sagen, als ich das Buch zum ersten Mal bestellt habe, da war ich noch sehr jung und ich konnte nicht sofort was damit anfangen. Ich habe das Buch gelesen und dachte ganz oft, das ist wirklich ein tolles Buch, es sind tolle Geschichten, das macht alles Sinn. Aber ich hatte ganz oft das Gefühl, vielleicht ist es bei mir gar nicht so. Vielleicht gibt es bei mir gar keine darunterliegenden Themen. Bei mir geht es eigentlich doch nur um diesen Wunsch, anders auszusehen, anders zu sein. Wenn ich wirklich ein bisschen anders wäre, wenn ich zufriedener mit mir wäre, dann hätte ich auch gar kein Problem. Deshalb brauche ich das Buch auch gar nicht. Und dann ist das Buch mir irgendwann ein paar Jahre später nochmal in die Hände gefallen. Ich glaube nicht an Zufall dabei. Und ich habe es nochmal gelesen und ich konnte das Ganze schon besser verstehen. Und heute, ehrlicherweise, bin ich ein großer Fan. Ich habe mit Anita häufiger schon zusammengearbeitet und dementsprechend hatte ich das Glück, schon mehrfach mit ihr zu sprechen und ihr zuzuhören und ja, wirklich in ihrer Weisheit zu lauschen. Ich glaube, so darf man es echt sagen. Und normalerweise bin ich kein Fangirl, ich bin es auch an der Front nicht, aber ich finde, sie ist wirklich eine tolle Frau und sie hat sich viel mit dem Thema auseinandergesetzt. Wie können wir eigentlich wieder zurückfinden zu uns? Wie können wir eigentlich wieder bewusst leben? Wie können wir an die Themen kommen, die wirklich, wirklich darunter liegen, während wir uns beschäftigt halten mit dem Wunsch, nach XYZ auszusehen oder zu haben? Ja, Anita lebt die meiste Zeit ihres Lebens und ist dort auch aufgewachsen auf Hawaii. Und ich hatte großes Glück, dass wir es geschafft haben, trotz des Zeitunterschieds uns per Zoom zu treffen. Und da haben wir ein kleines Gespräch aufgenommen. Das ist wieder auf Englisch. Das tut mir wirklich leid für alle, die Schwierigkeiten haben, Englisch zu verstehen. Es ist tatsächlich einfach so, dass sie kein Deutsch spricht und ich es bisher noch nicht geschafft habe, Podcasts zu übersetzen. Da fehlen mir die Mittel. Für alle, die es schaffen, da zuzuhören, freue ich mich und ich würde mich einfach freuen, wenn ihr da auch was rauszieht. Anita erklärt wirklich viel von ihren Ansichten. Sie erklärt viel über Weiblichkeit, über wie können wir uns eigentlich wieder mit uns selbst verbinden. Sie erklärt viel über, was sind eigentlich erste Schritte in so einem Heilungsprozess, wenn wir uns wieder anfreunden wollen mit einem gesunden Essverhalten und mit unserem Körper. Und sie erzählt sogar, wie könnte es anders sein, auch in dieser Podcast-Folge eine Geschichte. Und in dieser Geschichte und durch diese Geschichte erklärt sie einige Fragen, die ich ihr gestellt habe. Und das macht sie wirklich toll. Und dementsprechend kann ich nichts weiter tun, außer zu sagen, genießt die Folge. Ich bin mir sicher, ihr werdet was rausziehen. Und ihr findet in der Verlinkung auch nochmal das Buch und auch den Kurs, den sie anbietet, der auch wirklich zu empfehlen ist. So, Und hier mache ich jetzt einen Punkt. Ich glaube, die Message ist angekommen. Viel Freude beim Zuhören. Tschüss. Okay, so welcome, Anita. I'm very happy to have you here. And I'm very glad that you took the time to maybe talk about eating disorders, talking about why you're trying to help people with eating disorders and what your approach is like. And before we start, I would like to know a bit about you. Maybe you can say to me and to our listeners who you are and what you are doing.
Well, let's see, who am I? I'm a psychologist specializing in women's issues and, of course, eating difficulties. I'm originally from the island of Guam, which is where I was born and raised. Mm-hmm. And eventually, after going to school, I ended up in Hawaii for 30 years. But my background has been a lot around storytelling. So I grew up in a multi-ethnic, multicultural household. And a lot of the teachings were through story. And so that was sort of the beginning of my using story and using metaphor as a way of helping people. And then many years later, my children were going to school in Waldorf school. I believe you call them Steiner schools. And so they would come home from school with these stories about Prince division and Prince multiplication. And I thought, oh, if I had learned my times tables that way, I would probably know them to this day. Mm-hmm. So I realized there's this power in storytelling. And at the same time, I had a private practice working with individuals with eating disorders. And when I was trying to help them understand what was underneath the eating behaviors, because everybody can see the eating behaviors, but that's not the cause of it. And so how can you see the invisible? And that's when I realized using story and metaphor was a way that for eons, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans have done that. So that's been my approach. And it's been a joy for me. I love the work.
Yeah, it sounds like that. And it sounds very great. And I'm very happy that this book is even translated into German, because very many people that I talked to know the book. And I do have a few questions, of course, about the stories and metaphors. But before that, I just wanted to ask you, why are you so committed to work in the field of eating disorders?
Well, honestly, it's really not my commitment. My commitment is a little deeper than that. I am committed to shifting consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened that I discovered that those who struggle with eating disorders have a particular emotional sensitivity and a keen intuition that is exactly what's needed on this planet today. So because what comes with that is a great level of empathy and compassion. And I happen to believe that those who struggle with eating disorders and get on the recovery path are the ones the world has been waiting for. Because right now we need more empathy and compassion and connection. And so in a way, working with eating disorders, I kind of stumbled upon that. Mm-hmm. And when I realized the people I was working with had this capacity, it's just they were using it in the wrong direction, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like if somebody gives you a sword and you grab it by the blade end, you can hurt yourself. But if you understand how to work it, you can cut through things. And so my true commitment is to shifting the way humanity relates to each other and relates to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So it's not quite the same thing.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And well, getting to know ourselves, becoming more conscious. I mean, that's not an easy topic, I guess, obviously not. But is there anything you could recommend in the way, like, how can we get more in touch with our intuition? Because I feel like it's so easy said and very hard to really connect, especially when it comes to people or women with eating disorders. So is there a first step?
Yeah, I think the very qualities that a person cultivates for recovery from an eating disorder, and by the way, recovery is totally, completely possible. Okay, it's absolutely possible to be completely free of struggles with eating and food and body image. But the very skills that one develops are the ones that shift perception. And so you begin with what I call compassionate curiosity, because to recover from an eating disorder, one of the things you have to learn to do is to drop the judgment over what you're doing with food, or what you're not doing with food, or what you're supposed to be doing with food, and what others say you're doing with food. And that's not easy, because we live in a culture these days that judges everything, and food has become like a moral issue, and it doesn't belong in morality. But that's what's happened. And it's even in our language. We say good foods and bad foods, or if we ate something we thought we shouldn't have, we say, oh, I was bad today. Or if we are on a diet and we follow the diet, we say, oh, I was good. And so morality has gotten so entangled in it. And so learning to become curious. I mean, if you think about, if you're talking to a child and you say, why did you do that? You're not going to get an honest answer, right? They're going to tell you what they think you want to hear. But if you ask that very same question in a different way with the same words, oh, why did you do that? The answer you get will amaze you. And this is what happens on the recovery journey. Individuals learn how to get very curious about why they do what they do with food, why they're afraid of certain foods, why they binge on certain foods, because the foods themselves, if you can get curious in a compassionate way, will tell you exactly what the underlying issues are. And so, but it's coded. And the information, in order to get the information, you have to crack the code. And so that for me is where the joy of the recovery process is, because it's actually kind of fun when you start to see that, oh, sweet foods maybe have to do with me feeling like there's not enough sweetness in my life, or maybe I think I'm not sweet enough, or when I want crunchy, salty foods and I know I'm not hungry, that's probably because I'm angry and frustrated about something. What might that be? And maybe a craving for warm foods like soups or stews might be an indication that I need more emotional warmth in my life. And of course, with chocolate, we know from Valentine's, right? It's romance and love and sensuality and sexuality. So that's where it gets to be really kind of fun, that if you can be curious and crack this code, it can take you to a whole level of understanding about yourself beyond your wildest dreams. And when that happens, all kinds of doors start to open as well.
Right. And as you can see, but our listeners can't see, I'm nodding all the time, because I think it really makes sense to me. And nowadays I would say, yes, it's definitely like that. And who knows what else might be underneath, how much more there is to discover for me. But to be very honest, when I first read your book, and I of course was younger, but I was like, yeah, that all sounds good, it makes sense, but for me, I really just want to be skinny. It's not about anything underneath. And honestly, I'm not quite sure what really helped in the end. Maybe it's been time rereading it after a few years or whatever. But how can we, or how can stories help us just to, maybe relieve the ego and allow our souls or our own wisdom or just our curiosity to come in and to see that there's more than just the wish of being skinny?
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's such a common thing. People say, well, I just want to be skinny. Whenever you use the word just, that's a clue, right? Because that's a clue that there's something there, because you're already minimizing, you're already limiting your perception. Mm-hmm. So again, this is where curiosity comes into play, because it's like, oh, what is it about being skinny that would be so wonderful for me? Well, if I were skinny, I would attract the person that I'm interested in. Or if I were skinny, my parents wouldn't be bothering me so much about my weight. And you start getting curiouser and curiouser to see, well, what is it? Were you born that way when you were a little bitty baby? Did you go, oh, I wish my toes were more skinny? No. Where did that come from? Where did that idea come from? You see what I'm saying? So you get curious about it to see when did that become so important? And what do I think that's going to bring to my life? And you'll start to discover that so much of what we believe is conditioned and is not our true self. And so really what recovery is it's more like uncovering your true self that has been buried beneath all the nonsense. And it is nonsense, by the way, that our culture just dumps on us. And when we're young, and if you're emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive, you're like a sponge. You just absorb it. You think it's true without stopping to question it.
Right.
And when you start questioning it, who's the you that's questioning? That's your authentic self. And that is the part of you that's going to bring your freedom.
That's nice. Yeah. I mean, it's a big question, and you mentioned earlier that people are telling each other stories and metaphors like for a very long time, And then maybe, at least in our culture, we somehow lost it. We didn't do it anymore. And why is that? Because obviously it's necessary.
Well, we're very literal. That's what's happened. The culture has gone more and more and more literal. And stories require you to use your imagination, which is your imagination. So when I tell you a story, the pictures that you create in your mind are yours. And so that's what makes them so powerful, because they impact your psyche. But the other thing is, with stories, you can talk about things that might be too scary, too troubling, that you can't really talk about directly, but need to be explored. I'm trying to think right now of a story that I could tell to illustrate that. Let's go back to your skinny thing, okay? Because you're saying to yourself that in the past, you said, I just want to be skinny. There's nothing more to the story than this.
Right.
So what I would do is, and I would imagine that not being skinny enough causes a great deal of pain, right? I mean, that's why you would restrict more and more and more. I need to be, and of course, it's never skinny enough, right? It's just more and more and more skinny. Right. And so recognizing that there's pain around that. So here's a story. It's an old story. And these old stories, they're teaching tales that honestly, they've been embedded with information, because for years, people were tortured for this information. They were burned at the stake. They were murdered. I mean, this is deep, deep wisdom. But the women were the wisdom keepers. And many of these stories are Grimm's fairy tales, but as we know, those two German brothers, they weren't a couple of old men. They were very young guys, and they traveled all around Germany and other parts of Europe, and they gathered these stories. A lot of them came from women. Well, most of them came from women, young women. They had a younger sister, and they would ask her friends for the stories. And so the women were the story keepers and the wisdom keepers. And that's how come the stories never died. And of course, these two brothers, they wrote them down. So now we still have them. But for the most part, they were passed down from generation to generation to generation with this information coded in it. Now, to give you an idea about these stories, when you start to understand how they affect the psyche, they affect the psyche the way our dreams do, okay? So, because it's symbolic language. If you're dreaming about, maybe you have a dream and you're murdering the security guard at an art museum. Now, if you take that literally, you might think, oh my gosh, I have homicidal tendencies. But if you look at it symbolically, maybe you're trying to get rid of the part of yourself that is